In Port Blossom, Maine, a coastal town long known for its ocean harvest, the year 2022 suddenly brought a story that changed the community's atmosphere. The people of Port Blossom were used to living alongside the sea. Every morning the wharf was crowded with fishing boats returning, carrying lobsters, cod, squid, and clams. The salty smell of the ocean mixed with diesel fuel. The cries of fishmongers echoed loudly, and amidst it all, homemakers bustled, picking fresh ingredients to cook in their kitchens. From way back then until now, smoked lobster relish was always present as one of the signature specialties. Its texture was fine, savory, and it could last a long time, perfect to eat with warm biscuits or chowder. For the old-timers in Port Blossom, the lobster relish was a childhood memory. Many still remembered how their mothers used to sit in kitchens warmed by wood stoves, patiently sautéing spices, then stirring the dried lobster meat until the aroma filled the house. That simple food became a packed lunch for children heading to school, a companion on long journeys, even a comfort during hard winters. The lobster relish wasn't just a side dish, it was a symbol of perseverance and family love. But in 2022, something strange happened. A small shop in a narrow cobblestone alley near the old wharf suddenly started selling lobster relish with a different taste. From the outside, the shop was unremarkable. Its walls were faded, its steel door rusted, with no sign or promotional banner. There was only an old woman sometimes seen sitting in an old wooden rocking chair out front. But as soon as the relish from that shop got out, all of Port Blossom seemed to be shaken. The relish had a glistening golden red color. Its texture was soft and perfectly dry, yet it still felt moist on the tongue. When it touched hot toast, its savory aroma immediately wafted up, tempting people before they even had a chance to taste it. Once in the mouth, there was a perfectly balanced sweet and salty taste, leaving a strange aftertaste that made the tongue want to keep chewing. The first people who tried it said it wasn't like any other relish. There was something hard to explain, like an allure that made them long to taste it again. This news spread quickly. At the Port Blossom Historic Wharf Market, mothers who were usually busy haggling over vegetables were now asking each other which shop sold that special relish. The other vendors grew curious. Some even sent money with others to buy it for them first. One or two photos appeared on social media, showing the fine, glowing red relish in glass mason jars. The captions accompanying the photos made people even more curious. One wrote, "One bite and you'll want it again." Another said, "It tastes like food that makes your heart calm and anxious at the same time." This phenomenon created long lines in front of the shop every time a new batch came out. People were willing to wait since dawn, bringing folding chairs. Some even paid a local delivery driver just to ensure they got a share. The price of the relish doubled, then tripled. Yet it still sold out in just a few hours. At the local diner, the old men talked about it with astonished tones. Mr. Abernathy, a neighbor who lived not far from the shop, claimed he often heard the sound of a machine running loudly late into the night. He said the sound wasn't like a normal machine, its rhythm was erratic. Sometimes it stopped abruptly, then started again, like the gasping breath of someone out of air. Some people laughed at his story, thinking he was too old and overly suspicious. But a few young men walking home late from the church also claimed to hear a similar sound. Meanwhile, in homes, the lobster relish suddenly became popular. Everyone was competing to buy it, the residents' curiosity was piqued, and the lobster relish became the talk of the town. Children whined, asking for toast with that relish at every meal. One housewife even shared that her husband, who usually ate very little, always asked for a second helping since trying the magic relish. Some families stored several jars in their refrigerators, as if hoarding gold, worried about running out. Amidst the euphoria, some quietly felt anxious. A vegetable vendor named Mrs. Davies once muttered, "Why can it be so delicious? I know the ingredients for relish are just lobster, onions, and simple spices. What made the taste so different?" But curiosity was stronger than fear. People kept buying, kept praising, and kept ignoring the questions that popped up in their minds. A Sunday sermon at the town church briefly touched on this phenomenon. Young Pastor Dave warned the congregation not to get too caught up in idolizing food. He said the tongue could deceive the heart, and what is delicious isn't necessarily a blessing. But that warning was drowned out by the hustle and bustle of people still busy hunting for the magic lobster relish. Days passed, and demand increased. There were buyers from Portland, Bangor, and even from Boston who were willing to travel far. They bought up jars of the relish to bring home as gifts for family. Online sellers started joining in, adding to the euphoria. One batch was released, and hundreds of jars were gone in a matter of hours. In Port Blossom, a town full of fishermen's tales and coastal traditions, a single food item had suddenly managed to change the face of the community. That fragrant lobster relish had now become a new symbol of pride, as well as a baffling mystery. No one knew who actually prepared it. No one saw the process because the shop's steel door was always tightly closed. And behind that door, a dark story was waiting to be uncovered. A story that would later stun the entire state of Maine. That lobster relish wasn't just food. It was the beginning of a terrifying secret. The presence of Mrs. Blackwood, the dignified but secretive owner of the old shop. Behind the small shop's steel door stood the figure of a woman who rarely appeared in public. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. Among the neighbors, she was known as an old, white-haired woman whose hair was always in a tight bun, wearing a simple, dark gray apron. Her steps were slow, her voice never loud, but every glance from her eyes made people automatically look down. No one dared to call her name casually. The children in the alley only whispered if they saw her pass. The workers inside the shop also rarely spoke to her, unless absolutely necessary. Mrs. Blackwood's presence was like a shadow that commanded the room without a sound. Decades ago, she had gone through hard times. Her husband, a longshoreman, died in an accident while unloading a cargo ship. At that time, Mrs. Blackwood had just started her small business making the relish. Many thought she would give up. But the opposite happened. She rose up without tears, cleaned up the remnants of her broken equipment herself, and went back to work as if she had never fallen. Since then, she was known as a strong woman, but also increasingly secretive. It was said that after the accident, Mrs. Blackwood never again let anyone else control the relish-making process. She herself selected the lobsters, weighed the spices, and even supervised every stage. There was no written recipe. It was all in her head. The workers were only given outside tasks like weighing, packing, or delivering. The core process remained a secret that only she held. People who had worked in the shop often said the atmosphere inside was very different from the market. Quiet, tidy, and full of rules. If Mrs. Blackwood wasn't smiling, the room felt cold even in hot weather. If she was walking down the hall, all the workers looked down. No one dared to ask why the main processing room door was always locked. No one dared to look inside when the door opened slightly. The only person somewhat close to her was her son, Arthur. But even that closeness was limited. Arthur was only given the responsibility of delivering orders and speaking with customers. Even as her biological son, he was never allowed into the main processing room. The key to the door always hung around Mrs. Blackwood's neck like a charm she never took off. For outsiders, all this added to the mysterious impression. They saw a simple old woman, but behind her gaze, one could feel the weight of a heavy secret. Some neighbors said, "Ever since the relish from that shop became famous, Mrs. Blackwood's face has become harder to read. Sometimes she smiles faintly, but that smile is more like a cold line than warmth." There was a story from a young man named Jake who had worked there for only a week. He said that one night he saw a light on from the locked room, even though it was late. Curious, he approached, but before he could look closer, Mrs. Blackwood was suddenly standing behind him. With a calm but firm voice, she said, "Not all doors are meant to be opened." The next morning, Jake didn't come back. When asked by neighbors, he just answered briefly, "I couldn't handle working there." Despite the mystery, the community still regarded Mrs. Blackwood with respect. They considered her a tough woman who had successfully elevated the name of Port Blossom's lobster relish. She never got angry in public, never shouted, but it was precisely because of this that people were even more intimidated. In her every movement, there was a kind of authority that made everyone cautious. Chloe, the daughter-in-law married to Arthur, often felt alienated in Mrs. Blackwood's presence. Every time she came in bringing new energy, taking photos of the product to promote it, or suggesting packaging designs, Mrs. Blackwood's gaze remained the same, flat and unreadable. There was no rejection, but also no warm approval. It was as if Mrs. Blackwood let Chloe operate on the outside, but maintained a distance with an invisible wall. The locals got used to the presence of that mysterious figure. They rarely saw Mrs. Blackwood leave the house other than to go to the shop. Even when there was a neighborhood potluck, she would just send a small dish without attending. Many whispered that she kept too many secrets. But because her lobster relish was so popular, people chose to stay quiet. In Port Blossom, Mrs. Blackwood's name eventually became a sort of minor legend. Some called her a strong woman, others called her too secretive. But no one could deny that behind the steel door that was always locked, there was something that others were not allowed to know. And with each passing day, that secret grew larger, like a wave waiting for its moment to break on the shore. Arthur, her morose son, and Chloe, the spirited daughter-in-law, expanding the business. Arthur, Mrs. Blackwood's only son, was a very different person from his mother. His face was gentle, his eyes soft, as if still holding onto the remnants of an artist's soul that once dreamed of being a folk musician in a small Portland cafe. But since his father died, he left that dream behind and returned to Port Blossom to support his mother. Now, every day, he drove an old pickup truck, delivering jars of relish to customers. People at the market knew him as a quiet man. He rarely spoke, just offered a brief smile and moved on. But behind his quiet demeanor, many felt sympathy. Several times, Arthur was seen sitting alone on the shop's porch, staring at a jar of relish as if listening to something no one else could hear. On the other hand, Chloe, his wife, had a bright personality. She grew up in Portland, accustomed to the city atmosphere. Her hair was dyed light brown, her steps were quick, and her voice was friendly, greeting everyone. She was the first one who had the idea to photograph the product, upload it to Instagram, and do a live stream every time a new batch was out. Thanks to Chloe, the lobster relish, which was initially only known in the small market, suddenly appeared on restaurant tables from Portland to Boston. Chloe brought new energy to the family business, redesigning the labels, adding a small ribbon to make it look more high-end. She also networked with souvenir shops and even contacted large distributors in Portland. In the eyes of outsiders, Chloe was the light in the middle of the shop's gloomy atmosphere. However, all that light seemed to dim when faced with Mrs. Blackwood. Every time Chloe entered the shop, the workers seemed happy. The atmosphere became livelier. But Mrs. Blackwood's gaze remained the same, calm but stiff. No comments, no words of thanks. It was as if all of Chloe's hard work was just passing wind. Chloe had tried several times to get closer. She told her husband, "I really want to learn how to make the relish directly from your mother, so I can help one day." But Mrs. Blackwood's answer was always the same, short and cold. "You just handle the sales. Leave the relish to me." Since then, Chloe stopped pushing, but curiosity remained in her eyes. Every time she walked down the shop's hallway, she would glance at the steel door that was always locked. Only from there did the strong aroma of new relish often emanate, mixed with the smell of onions and something foreign. Chloe's relationship with Arthur was actually harmonious. Arthur loved his wife in his quiet way. He often drove Chloe to the market or kept her company during her live streams. Although he just sat in the corner without speaking, sometimes he looked restless. Especially when Chloe got too enthusiastic asking about the relish-making process. Arthur knew there was a line he wasn't allowed to cross. The workers at the shop also saw Mrs. Blackwood's different attitude toward her daughter-in-law. They whispered that the mother had never truly accepted Chloe, even though she never openly rejected her. The relationship was like a thin, taut thread, not broken, but never loose. One time, Chloe tried to bring a small camera to record the atmosphere of the outer processing area. She wanted to make a simple promotional video. But when the camera's red light turned on, Mrs. Blackwood suddenly appeared from behind. With a low but clear voice, she said, "Not everything is meant to be shown off." Chloe fell silent, then turned off the camera. She never tried to film inside the shop again. Even so, from the outside, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sales increased, more customers came, and Chloe became more well-known online. Many women in Portland followed her streams, praising her friendliness. But inside the house, she still felt the coldness from her mother-in-law. The cold mother-in-law/daughter-in-law relationship, Chloe's curiosity about the secret recipe. Every time they had dinner together, the conversation was brief. Arthur occasionally tried to break the ice, but Mrs. Blackwood was mostly silent. That small uneasiness gradually grew into a question in Chloe's heart. Why was Mrs. Blackwood so fierce about guarding the relish's secret? Why was the main room door always locked, and why, every time she asked, was the answer just short and dismissive? One afternoon, as a light rain fell on Port Blossom, Chloe stood for a long time in front of that steel door. Her hand almost touched the handle, but Mrs. Blackwood's footsteps were heard from behind. With a faint smile, Mrs. Blackwood just said, "Don't forget to close the kitchen window. The draft is coming in." Chloe, startled, quickly stepped back. And from that moment, she felt even more certain that something was being hidden behind that door. She didn't know that her curiosity would later drag her to a fate she had never imagined. That day, a light rain had been falling since noon. Port Blossom was shrouded in a gray sky. The salty smell of the sea mixed with the wet earth. As usual, Chloe came to the shop carrying a cloth bag containing her phone and a small tripod. She had just finished a live stream at the market. Her face was still fresh, though her clothes were damp from the drizzle. Her voice was cheerful as she offered jars of relish to customers on the screen. As usual, she was met with smiles and laughter. In the front room of the shop, several workers were arranging orders. The relish was wrapped neatly in clear plastic, layered with gold-colored paper, then put into cardboard boxes. Chloe stood nearby, occasionally helping, occasionally joking with the young workers. Her presence always livened up the atmosphere. No one knew it would be the last time they saw her smile. That night, when the other workers had gone home, Chloe was still at the shop. She said she wanted to wait for Arthur, who was delivering an order to Portland. A neighbor briefly saw her standing in front of the shop door, talking on the phone with someone. After that, no one saw her come out again. The next morning, the online customer messaging group was suddenly quiet. Chloe's social media account, usually bustling with promotional posts, was suddenly inactive. Incoming messages piled up. Questions from customers went unanswered. Some people thought she was sick or just resting. But as the days passed, the silence became more awkward. Her phone number couldn't be reached. It always went straight to voicemail. When a worker dared to ask Mrs. Blackwood, the answer was calm. "Chloe went back to her hometown. Her mother is sick." "No need to worry." The answer sounded reasonable, but it slowly raised questions. Chloe's family in Portland was, in fact, shocked to hear the news. Her mother was in good health. No one was seriously ill. They themselves hadn't received any news from Chloe. Arthur looked increasingly gloomy. He rarely spoke. His eyes often stared blankly at the floor. Every time someone asked about his wife, he just answered briefly, "Chloe is fine." But his lips were dry, his hands trembled, as if carrying a heavy burden he couldn't express. Meanwhile, the shop's activities actually ran more smoothly. Mrs. Blackwood now stepped in to manage sales directly. She contacted large customers, arranged deliveries, and even occasionally delivered orders herself. Strangely, even without Chloe's presence, sales didn't drop. In fact, demand increased. The lobster relish from that shop became even more popular. The workers began to whisper, why, after Chloe disappeared, did the relish taste even more delicious than before? Some said the texture was softer, others said the aroma was deeper. A young worker even joked with a pale face, the relish now tastes like it has something in it that makes people addicted. No one responded to the joke. Everyone was silent. Only the sound of the grinding machine from the locked room echoed. The sound of the machine at midnight, a strange odor and growing suspicion. Mr. Abernathy, the old neighbor, also felt something was strange. Several nights after Chloe disappeared, he heard the machine working much later than usual. A sharp smell, like antiseptic, seeped through the cracks of his house window. He wanted to complain, but his steps faltered every time he remembered Mrs. Blackwood's cold stare. A full week passed without news. Chloe seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. No messages, no calls, no signs. People started to get restless. Some loyal customers tried to contact Arthur, but he became even more withdrawn. The workers at the shop didn't dare ask any further. At the Port Blossom Historic Market, the women who used to greet Chloe warmly began to wonder. A close friend of hers said that 2 days before she disappeared, Chloe was still planning to celebrate her birthday at a small diner near the beach. That plan never happened. The silence turned into fear. It was as if a thin veil covered the truth, and everyone chose to pretend they didn't see it. The relish continued to be produced. Jar after jar came out of the shop door. From the outside, it looked like a success. But in the hearts of the people who had known Chloe, there was an emptiness that was hard to explain. In Port Blossom, the news of a friendly young woman's disappearance should have been a big concern. But strangely, this time, everyone seemed to be silent. Only whispers in the corners of the market, only suspicious glances from neighbors. Only silent prayers from a family who didn't know where to look. And behind it all, the steel door of the processing room remained tightly locked, guarding a secret that grew more terrifying by the day. Chloe suddenly disappears without a trace. Mrs. Blackwood gives a false excuse that she went home. Days passed without Chloe's presence. A week became 2, then it was the 2nd month. People began to get used to her absence, although in their hearts, they still held questions. At the market, customers who used to chat warmly with her now only asked in hushed tones, "How is Chloe?" And the answer was always the same. She went home to take care of her mother. But behind that answer, there were many inconsistencies. Chloe's phone remained off. Her social media accounts were never active again. No letters or messages of any kind ever reached her family in Portland. And most strikingly, every time someone dared to ask further, Mrs. Blackwood's face remained calm. She only answered as needed, then changed the subject. Arthur sank deeper into silence. He no longer delivered orders every day. That job was now mostly taken over by his mother. Arthur was often seen sitting in the small warehouse behind the shop, staring blankly at the cement wall. Sometimes he brought his old guitar, but rarely strummed it. The strings were dusty. The music had vanished along with his smile. The workers also felt the change. Before, whenever there was a live stream, they enjoyed it because the atmosphere was lively. Now the shop felt cold. The machines kept running. The jars of relish remained neatly lined up. But there was no laughter. The fragrant aroma of the relish now felt suffocating, as if harboring a secret. Some workers began to talk about strange things they experienced. A young man named Jake said he often heard the grinding machine working in the middle of the night, even when there was no production scheduled. He also once saw a light on from behind the tightly locked steel door. When asked, Mrs. Blackwood's answer was brief, preparing a large order for someone else. A woman named Beth claimed she had smelled a pungent odor, like hospital disinfectant, mixed with the aroma of the relish. The smell made her dizzy. But when she voiced her complaint, Mrs. Blackwood just stared with sharp eyes and said, "If you can't stand it, you can leave." Beth fell silent, though her heart was pounding. Meanwhile, sales actually increased drastically. Major restaurants in Portland were ordering in large quantities. There were even requests from New York. People said the relish from that shop had a unique, unforgettable taste. They called it the magic relish, one bite and you wanted more. That phenomenon made the shop busier, but also more secretive. Mr. Abernathy, the old neighbor whose house was just 2 alleys away, grew more suspicious. One night, he walked past the back of the shop. From a ventilation slit, he heard a sound like something heavy being dragged. Then he heard the sound of rushing water as if something was being washed. A rancid, coppery smell wafted out, making his stomach turn. He was about to knock, but his feet felt heavy, as if a shadow was holding him back. He went home with a tight chest and never dared to go near it again. Arthur himself lived in a dilemma. He knew something was wrong, especially since Chloe disappeared. But every time he tried to ask his mother, the answer that came out was just cold. "Stay out of this." Arthur would look down, but his eyes held deep unrest. Several times, workers saw him standing for a long time in front of the steel door. His hand nearly touched the handle, but he always pulled back when he heard his mother's footsteps. Amidst all the oddities, the shop continued to operate as usual. Delivery trucks came and went. Customers praised the relish's taste. Money flowed in. From the outside, everything looked successful, but from the inside, there was an unexplainable fear. People started whispering at the market. Was Chloe's disappearance connected to the relish becoming more popular? Some laughed it off, considering it just gossip. But others fell silent, choosing not to buy any more, though they were afraid to say it outright. Mrs. Blackwood continued to walk with a steady pace. Her hair was in its neat bun, her face expressionless. Every time she passed the workers, they automatically looked down. No one dared to meet her eyes for too long. There was an invisible power in her figure that made people feel small. And behind the steel door that was always locked, the secret thickened. The machine ran endlessly. The strange smell became more frequent, and Chloe's shadow seemed to cling to the shop walls. Every night, Arthur heard a faint sound, whether from his own mind or from behind the wall. Like his wife's voice calling, faintly, drowned out by the thudding of the machine. The silence had now turned into a quiet terror. No one dared to ask anymore, but everyone felt there was something far darker than just lobster relish. Arthur's gloom. Workers began to whisper about mysterious sounds and lights from the locked room. The nights in Port Blossom grew longer for the relish shop workers. The sound of the machine, usually only heard during the day, now often rumbled late into the night. For the residents nearby, the sound was like the groan of metal being dragged, mixed with a low electrical hum. Jake, the young man often asked to lift sacks of lobster, was heading home late one night. He passed the alley behind the shop and saw a dim light shining through a crack in the steel door. Curiosity made him approach. Through the small gap, he saw a shadow scrubbing something in the large machine. Water sprayed heavily, splashing onto the wall, leaving faint red stains. Jake, startled, immediately backed away, but his foot hit an empty can. The clanging sound made the shadow inside stop moving. He held his breath and ran as fast as he could. The next day, Jake worked as usual. But when he looked at Mrs. Blackwood, the woman just smiled faintly, not angry, not questioning, just staring as if she knew everything. That look made Jake tremble all day. The smell also got weirder. Beth, the worker in the packing section, felt dizzy several times when opening the jars. She smelled a strong aroma like a hospital mixed with the smell of burning hair. Once, she said to Arthur in a low voice, "This relish is different, sir." Arthur turned, his eyes red, but he only replied, "Don't talk so much. Just keep working." The atmosphere inside the shop changed. There was no more laughter, only the sound of machines and scraping metal. The workers worked in silence. Their eyes often met with anxiety. They all knew something was wrong, but no one dared to ask. One morning, a new worker named Sam suddenly didn't show up again. He had only been working for a week, still naive, often asking questions. The night before, he was seen helping carry sacks into the inner room. The next morning, his bed in the dorm was empty. When asked, Mrs. Blackwood answered briefly he couldn't cut it. Went home. No further explanation. Sam's belongings were also gone, as if he had never existed. The whispers grew louder. Some workers believed Sam just left, but others were convinced something had happened. Beth even cried quietly in the kitchen corner, feeling terrified every time she passed that steel door. Mr. Abernathy, the old neighbor, grew more distressed. Several times he had nightmares of a young woman with light brown hair standing in front of the shop. Her face was pale, her lips trembling without a sound. When he woke up, he could still smell the pungent odor carried on the night wind. He began to wonder, was that Chloe's restless spirit? Meanwhile, the lobster relish from the shop was in higher demand than ever. Customers from New York were even willing to pay more to get it. They said the taste was stronger, more addictive. A restaurant owner said at an event, "This relish has a flavor that can't be explained. It's like something sticks to your tongue and your memory." Every time she heard such praise, Mrs. Blackwood just smiled faintly. Her hands stayed busy writing down orders, as if everything was normal. But behind her smile, there was a dark shadow that made anyone shudder if they looked too long. Arthur sank deeper. He rarely left the house, rarely spoke, barely even ate. Sometimes workers saw him standing for a long time in front of the steel door, his hands clutching his old guitar, his face blank. A few times, he was seen wiping away tears when the aroma of the relish wafted out too strongly. For the workers, the shop was no longer a place to earn a living. It was like a prison. They worked because they were afraid of losing their livelihood, but every day felt like stepping on fragile ground. No one knew when the secret behind the steel door would be revealed, or when they themselves might become part of that secret. The following nights, the machine noise grew louder, the smell more piercing, and fear became a habit. Everyone tried to close their eyes, as if pretending not to know would mean nothing would happen to them. But the whispers never truly went away. Everyone realized that since Chloe disappeared, the lobster relish shop was no longer just a production site. It had changed into something else. Something darker than just a food processing kitchen. Daryl, the delivery driver, witnesses Mrs. Blackwood washing the grinding machine in a strange way. The phenomenon of the Port Blossom lobster relish began to spread out of state. If it was once only known in the local market, now those small jars appeared on restaurant tables in Portland, Bangor, and even New York. People talked about it on social media, calling it the most delicious relish they had ever had. At a cafe in Portland, a food blogger tasted it while live streaming. After one spoonful, his expression changed. He said with a trembling voice, "This doesn't taste like normal relish. They're sweet, they're salty, but also something deep that sticks to your tongue and doesn't go away even after drinking water." The audience was captivated. Comments flooded in, making orders skyrocket. A housewife in Boston shared that after eating the relish, she cried without reason. Her eyes were wet, her chest tight, but her hand kept scooping up crackers with the relish. She said, "I don't know why, there's a taste that makes me miss someone who's gone." A similar experience was had by a college student in Bangor. He was usually a vegetarian, but when he tried this relish, he couldn't stop. That night, he had a strange dream. In his dream, he saw long hair spread out on the dining table, mixed with the fibers of the relish. He woke up in a cold sweat, but strangely, he still wanted to eat more. Stories like that spread quickly. People began to call the Port Blossom lobster relish food with a ghostly flavor. Some linked it to ancestral prayers. Others assumed it was an ancient recipe owned only by a specific family. But the more people asked, the fewer clear answers there were. At the shop, Mrs. Blackwood continued to work calmly. Her smile was faint, her gaze deep. Every time she heard a customer's praise, she just nodded, as if she knew all along. Arthur grew more morose but didn't dare speak. The workers also heard the strange stories. Beth, who had once felt dizzy from the smell, one day accidentally tasted a bit of spilled relish. That night, she dreamed her body was covered in red fibers growing out of her skin. She screamed in her sleep, waking her roommate. The next morning, she was pale and terrified. But strangely, her tongue still craved the taste of that relish. This phenomenon even made the local news. A television station covered the small shop in Port Blossom, showing the long lines of people wanting to buy. A reporter asked Mrs. Blackwood about the secret to the relish's taste. With a faint smile, she answered briefly, "Just fresh lobster and a family recipe." Nothing more. That simple answer just made people more curious. But behind the praise, other whispers emerged. Some people asked if the relish contained an addictive substance. Some suspected it was mixed with chemicals. A doctor in Portland said he had received patients who felt dizzy and nauseous after eating too much of the relish. But when checked, the lab results showed nothing. Meanwhile, customers continued to flood the shop. Delivery trucks left every day carrying hundreds of jars to various cities. Money flowed in. The workers got busier. But amidst the hustle, the fear never left. Mr. Abernathy, the old neighbor, became more convinced something was wrong. He saw the faces of people leaving the shop carrying jars of relish. Their eyes sparkled as if they were carrying treasure. He muttered to himself, "Food isn't supposed to make people like that. There's something darker in it." And the nights in Port Blossom became filled with whispers. People asked in their hearts, is what we're eating really just lobster relish or something else? Something that should never have made it to a human dinner table. A package of relish breaks. Daryl finds an object resembling a human bone. One morning, a regular customer named Mrs. Davies came rushing to the shop. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, holding a jar of relish she had bought a week ago. She said with a shaky voice, "When I opened this jar, there was a strange smell, not just lobster." Then she showed a small object she had found inside. The object looked hard, pale yellowish, the size of a popcorn kernel. When the workers looked closer, there was a fine groove, like a joint line. "Mrs. Davies said quietly, I thought it was a fish bone, but the more I looked, I got scared." Mrs. Blackwood immediately grabbed the jar. Her eyes were calm as she replied, "It's just lobster cartilage. No need to worry." Her voice was flat, leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Davies fell silent, then went home with unsteady steps. But the incident left anxiety among the workers. They whispered to each other, was it really lobster cartilage or something else? A few days later, a young worker named Mikey was cleaning up spilled relish. He felt something hard at his fingertips. When he looked, it was a small piece resembling a thin, curved fingernail. His face went pale. He quickly hid it in his pocket. But from the corner of the room, Mrs. Blackwood stood watching. Her smile was faint, her eyes sharp. Mikey trembled, then pretended to continue his work. He couldn't sleep that night. He kept feeling the small object in his pocket, then finally threw it into the river with a sense of guilt. Stories like that became more frequent. Some customers complained the new relish had too sharp an aroma. Some said the taste seemed mixed with something foreign. But strangely, everyone kept buying. In fact, the strange taste made them even more addicted. In the houses around Port Blossom, small children began demanding the relish at every meal. There was one boy who refused to eat his food without it. His mother was confused, but didn't dare forbid it, because the child would scream hysterically every time the relish ran out. Mr. Abernathy, the old neighbor, grew more distressed. He heard the news about the strange bone fragment, the pungent smell, and the addicted children. He tried to advise some neighbors to stop buying, but the answer was always the same. "It tastes too good, I can't stop." Mr. Abernathy could only sigh deeply, feeling alone in his suspicion. At the shop, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The workers worked in silence. Every step felt monitored. The strange smell appeared more often, especially every time the large machine was turned on. Sometimes they smelled hot metal. Sometimes the smell of burning hair mixed with the aroma of lobster. Arthur sank deeper into his sadness. He rarely spoke, rarely went out. Several times, workers saw him sitting for a long time in front of the steel door. His eyes were red, his face pale. Someone said they once saw him shedding tears when he heard the sound of the machine from behind that door. Mrs. Blackwood kept walking with a calm gait. Her hair was in its neat bun, her face expressionless. Every time there was a complaint from a customer or worker, she always answered briefly, "There's nothing strange. Just a family recipe." And every time she said that, everyone fell silent, not daring to ask further. But the secret was becoming harder to hide. The bone fragments, the small nail, the strange smell, and the overwhelming taste began to form a dark story amid the community's whispers. People began to ask in their hearts, is this lobster relish really just from the sea, or is there something from the land that has melted into it? And every night, the sound of the machine from behind the steel door continued to hum, swallowing the answers that were never spoken. Daryl writes an anonymous letter to the police, triggering a secret investigation. Daryl, the delivery driver who had worked at the relish shop for 2 years, was known as a simple man. He rarely talked, just focused on his job of delivering goods to Portland or Bangor. That night, heavy rain lashed the streets. He had to leave later than usual because of a sudden order for a large restaurant. In the shop's yard, several workers were preparing boxes of relish jars. Daryl helped lift them. His hands were slick with rain. Suddenly, one of the boxes slipped from his grasp and fell hard onto the cement floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed. Everyone froze. Mrs. Blackwood came out of the inner room with quick steps. Her face was flat, but her gaze was sharp. She said curtly, "Be careful. Don't break them." Daryl knelt, his hands covered in the soft, red relish spilled on the floor. As he was about to clean it up, his fingers touched something hard. He felt it slowly, then picked it up. A small, yellowish-white object, a short cylinder with a slightly curved end. There were fine grooves, like a joint. Daryl's heart pounded. He knew that shape well. Years ago, before becoming a driver, he had worked as a janitor in a hospital morgue. His eyes were used to seeing fragments of human bone. And what was in his hand now, he was sure, was a phalange from a little finger. Daryl held his breath. He quickly balled his fist around the object and hid it in his palm. He pretended to continue cleaning up the spilled relish. From a distance, he could feel Mrs. Blackwood's stare fixed on his back. After everything was cleaned up, he got into his truck, his hands still shaking. Heavy rain pounded the windshield. The wipers squeaked back and forth. He drove slowly, navigating the narrow road toward the city. But his mind was not at ease. The small object in his pocket felt hot, as if burning his skin. Halfway through the drive, Daryl pulled over on a deserted stretch of road. He cut the engine, took a deep breath, and opened his hand. Under the cabin light, the object was clear. A human finger bone, clean, slick as if it had been boiled, the end still showing the remnant of a joint. Daryl almost threw up. He closed his eyes, but the image of Chloe's face appeared in his mind. The woman's warm smile the last time he'd seen her, arranging relish jars for a live stream. Since then, Chloe had vanished without a trace. Daryl's throat tightened. He realized what he had found was no accident. There was something horrific hidden within the relish he had been hauling to various cities. He had delivered hundreds of jars. Thousands of people had eaten it. And perhaps in every bite, there was a part of someone who had once lived. Daryl started the engine again, but his hands were still trembling. He felt as if he wasn't just carrying food, but a bloody secret that had trapped him with no way out. That night, he didn't go straight home. After delivering the order, he stopped at his small apartment near the market. On his rickety wooden table, he placed the small bone, wrapping it in 3 layers of clear plastic. His eyes never left it, as if the object was alive and watching him. His heart beat like a war drum. He knew if he stayed silent, the secret would be buried forever. But if he spoke up, his own life could be at stake. Outside, the rain still poured, tapping on the tin roof like a rhythm of death. Daryl sat hunched over, staring at the plastic-wrapped evidence. He whispered faintly to himself, "This has to be told. If not, Chloe, or whoever else is missing, will never get justice." That night, after staring for a long time at the small finger bone he had found, Daryl felt his mind spinning. He couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain hitting his apartment's tin roof only made his heart more restless. Every time he closed his eyes, Chloe's face appeared, followed by faint whispers from his memory of seeing the large machine in the shop spinning at night. He knew that if he just spoke without proof, no one would believe him. Mrs. Blackwood was too respected, her lobster relish too adored. Who would listen to a simple delivery driver like him? So, he decided to write down his testimony with a trembling hand. He took a piece of paper from his son's old notebook stored in a drawer. He began to write slowly, "My name is Daryl. I work as a driver at Mrs. Blackwood's lobster relish shop. I'm writing this because I'm afraid something will happen to me. I found an object I believe is a human bone inside the relish. I also saw blood being cleaned from the grinding machine one night. I suspect people are missing, including Chloe, Mrs. Blackwood's daughter-in-law. If this letter reaches the police, it means I'm gone." The pen ink smudged on the paper, mixed with the cold sweat dripping from his forehead. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it under a loose floorboard in his room. After that, he put the bone fragment into a small plastic bag and stored it in an old coffee can, sealing it tightly. The next day, he went to work as usual. He started his truck, delivered orders, and greeted customers with a friendly face. But behind that smile, his heart was pounding. Every time he met Mrs. Blackwood's gaze, it felt like the woman could read his mind. Every time they passed, Daryl felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he couldn't report it openly. If Mrs. Blackwood found out, his life could be over. So he looked for a way. That night, he went to a diner near the bus terminal and pretended to write down delivery addresses in a notebook. In reality, he was copying the contents of his testimony onto a small piece of paper. A few days later, while delivering an order to Portland, he made a quick stop near the police precinct. With quick steps, he dropped the small letter into the mailbox out front. His hand was shaking, but there was a small sense of relief. At least now there was a trail that could lead to the truth. But he wasn't fully relieved. Every night, fear still haunted him. He often woke up from nightmares. In his dreams, he saw Chloe standing in front of his truck. Her face was pale, her hands covered in red relish fibers. Chloe didn't speak, just stared with wet eyes. At the shop, the atmosphere grew more frightening. The machine ran more often. The strange smell was stronger. Some of the other workers also started to get restless. Beth said she heard a faint crying sound from behind the steel door, even though no one was inside but Mrs. Blackwood. Mikey, the young man who had found the fingernail, chose to quit, citing illness. He was never seen in the neighborhood again. Something big and dark was happening behind that door. And if he didn't act soon, more people would disappear. That night, he sat in his apartment, staring at the coffee can containing the small bone. In a whisper, he said, "I promise I'll get the truth out, even if it costs me my own life." Outside, the sea breeze carried the smell of salt mixed with the smell of metal. Port Blossom sank into silence. Meanwhile, behind the small shop's steel door, the grinding machine continued to hum, guarding a secret that was becoming harder to cover up. Police go undercover as inspectors, begin investigating the relish shop. In Portland, a police precinct was busy one morning with stacks of files. A mail clerk brought in a pile of incoming mail and placed it on the reception desk. From the dozens of ordinary envelopes, One caught the attention of a young detective named Miller. The letter had no return address, just hurried writing on the cover, for anyone brave enough to uncover the truth. Miller opened it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he read the handwritten contents, full of shaky scratches. The letter told of the famous lobster relish from Port Blossom that might be mixed with human flesh. He read word by word, his heart pounding. Names were mentioned vaguely. There were descriptions of a grinding machine, a strange smell, and a woman named Chloe who had disappeared without a trace. At first, he thought it was just a joke or slander from a business competitor. But the last sentence made his blood run cold. I found a human bone in the relish. I'm keeping it. If this letter has arrived, it means my life is in danger. Miller swallowed hard. He knew this case couldn't be taken lightly. He reported it to his superior, Captain Russo, an experienced and famously strict officer. The captain read it quickly, then nodded slowly. We can't be reckless. If this is real, it's a massive case. If it's false, it could be slander that ruins someone's name. They decided to form a small team for a covert investigation. No official assignment papers, just verbal orders. 2 detectives were sent to Port Blossom, posing as health inspectors conducting a food safety survey. They began to observe Mrs. Blackwood's relish shop from a distance, noting who went in and out, how often the machine ran, and when deliveries were made. On the other side, Daryl lived his days with mixed feelings. There was some relief because the letter had been sent, but also a growing anxiety. He felt that eyes were always watching him. Sometimes when he sat at the diner, he saw someone watching from across the street. Sometimes when delivering orders, he heard a motorcycle following him for a long time before finally disappearing. One night when he returned to his apartment, he found his door slightly ajar. He was sure he had locked it before leaving. His heart hammered. With careful steps, he entered. Nothing was missing. But the floorboard where he had hidden the first letter looked slightly shifted. He immediately checked the coffee can with the bone. It was still there, but the plastic's position wasn't the same. Daryl gasped. It meant someone knew, or at least suspected. He closed it back up and sat on the floor for a long time, staring blankly. A whisper rose in his mind. I have to be faster. Or I'll be the next one to disappear. Meanwhile, at the shop, Mrs. Blackwood showed no signs of suspicion. She continued to smile kindly at buyers, still gave firm instructions to the workers. However, some felt her gaze had become sharper, as if she already knew who had dared to defy her. One morning, Daryl was called into the back room by Beth. The woman looked pale. She whispered quickly. I heard whispers. Mrs. Blackwood said, there's a rat among us. A rat that will bring disaster to everyone. You be careful, Daryl. Daryl just nodded, though his heart was pounding violently. He knew he was the rat. In Portland, the investigative team got new information. They found a missing persons report in Port Blossom that had never been resolved. One of them was named Hannah, a part-time worker at the relish shop. According to her family, Hannah had never come home 3 months ago. A report was filed, but there was no follow-up. All of this began to connect with the anonymous letter. Captain Russo realized this case was deeper than they thought. He ordered the team to immediately find physical evidence, especially the bone mentioned in the letter. But the problem was, there was no clear address for the sender. They only knew someone named Daryl, a delivery driver. That night in his simple apartment, Daryl wrote again. He copied everything he knew into a new notebook. He wrote about the strange smell, about blood on the machine, about the disappearances of Chloe and Hannah. He even drew a rough sketch of the grinding machine he had once seen. When the pen stopped, he looked out the window. The sea breeze carried the sound of waves mixed with the sound of a machine in the distance. His heart said, the real fight is just beginning. At a small diner in Portland, Detective Miller sat with a cup of black coffee in front of him. The simple wooden table was covered with maps, photos of Mrs. Blackwood's relish shop, notes from observations, and the names of the workers. His heart was still shaken by the contents of the anonymous letter. But as a detective, He knew his job was to find the person who wrote that letter. Without that source, everything would just be considered gossip and rumors. Through a network of contacts, he got word about a delivery driver named Daryl. The man had recently been keeping to himself, rarely speaking, and always looked anxious. Miller's suspicion grew stronger that Daryl was the author of the letter he had received. He decided to approach Daryl in a subtle, indirect way. 2 days later, Daryl was waiting for a pickup at the Port Blossom Market. A middle-aged man greeted him kindly, asking if Daryl could help deliver some goods to Portland. Daryl turned suspicious. The man's face was unfamiliar. He answered briefly that he already had a full-time job. The man just nodded, not pushing. From that day on, Daryl felt he was being watched even more frequently, though he didn't know that the man was actually part of Detective Miller's team. Meanwhile, at the relish shop, the atmosphere grew more tense. Mrs. Blackwood often stood for long periods in front of the production room door, which was always locked. Her gaze pierced every worker. Occasionally, she mentioned the word rat in conversation, making everyone look at each other with pale faces. Beth approached Daryl one afternoon. With a trembling voice, she whispered that she heard Mrs. Blackwood was going to call someone from out of town to settle things. Daryl froze. He understood very well that settle didn't mean anything good. That night in his apartment, Daryl opened the coffee can where he kept the bone he had found. His hand trembled. He thought hard. Should he turn the evidence over to the police right now or wait for the right moment? He was afraid that if he came forward openly, he himself would be considered the perpetrator. In Portland, Detective Miller received a new report from the undercover team. There was a flow of money into a shell company account controlled by Mrs. Blackwood. The amounts weren't large, but they were suspicious. All of this pointed to one conclusion: there was a serious crime behind the relish business. Miller knew his next step. He had to meet Daryl directly. But he also understood that the person who wrote the letter was living in great fear. To gain his trust, he had to be careful. A few days later, Daryl was sitting at the small wharf, waiting for his truck to be loaded. Suddenly, a man came and sat next to him without asking. The man introduced himself as Miller from Portland. He said he wasn't there to cause trouble, but to help. He stated that he knew Daryl was the one who wrote the anonymous letter. Daryl was stunned, his face pale. He wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen. Miller looked at him calmly and said he believed Daryl wasn't a criminal, just a witness. He added that the police needed the evidence and that he shouldn't keep it himself. Daryl didn't answer right away. He just looked down, his hands gripping his knees. His body was trembling with fear. In a voice barely audible, he whispered, asking if he would be safe if he handed over the evidence. Miller nodded reassuringly, saying that he and his team would protect Daryl. The meeting didn't last long. Daryl didn't hand anything over that day. He just said he would think about it. But deep inside, a small seed of hope began to grow. Elsewhere, Mrs. Blackwood received a phone call from someone with a deep, cold voice. The person said that someone was starting to betray her, and she had to act fast before everything was exposed. Mrs. Blackwood replied calmly that she had already prepared her next move and that no one who dared to cross her would get out alive. That night, several strange men were seen around the shop. They didn't go in, just sat at the diner across the alley, watching. Beth saw them and immediately ran to find Daryl. With a panicked look, she said they weren't locals, and she was sure they were the people Mrs. Blackwood had called. Daryl's chest tightened. He realized his time was running out. He had to decide quickly whether to hand the evidence over to the police or hold on to it longer. If he was too late, he might be the next victim. In his apartment, he stared at the coffee can for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and prayed. He asked for strength and protection, to be shown the right path. That morning, the Port Blossom air felt humid. The sea breeze carried the sharp smell of salt. Daryl stood in front of his apartment door, clutching a small black plastic bag. Inside, it was the coffee can containing the pale white bone he had hidden for so long. He hadn't slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, Chloe's image appeared, smiling, then disappearing. He felt the time had come. He couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. With heavy steps, he headed to the town's bus terminal. From there, he took a commuter bus to Portland, sitting in the back, clutching the plastic bag tightly. Every time the bus stopped, he felt like eyes were watching him. He kept his head down, not daring to look out the window for too long. At the Portland Police Precinct, Detective Miller waited restlessly. He had received a brief message that Daryl was coming. When his office door knocked, Miller stood up immediately. Daryl entered, his face pale and his eyes red, as if he hadn't slept all night. He placed the plastic bag on the table without saying a word. Miller opened it slowly, taking a deep breath when he saw the contents of the can. The small bone was still intact, with the joint at the end. He knew this object wasn't just an animal bone. As a detective, he had seen many cases, but this sight made the hair on his neck stand up. Daryl finally spoke. In a hoarse voice, he recounted what he had seen. The machine that kept running at night, the strange, piercing smell, and the disappearances of several workers, including Chloe. He confessed he had been afraid to report it because he felt his life was in danger. Miller listened without interrupting, noting every detail. After Daryl finished, Miller clapped him on the shoulder. He said that Daryl's courage would save many people. He promised to provide protection but also asked Daryl to be careful. Meanwhile, in Port Blossom, the atmosphere at the relish shop grew more suspicious. Mrs. Blackwood began calling workers in one by one, questioning them in a cold tone. Her gaze was piercing, as if trying to read their minds. Some workers just looked down, answering vaguely. Beth trembled when it was her turn. Mrs. Blackwood stared at her for a long time, then said quietly that she didn't like traitors. Outside the room, the two strange men who were previously at the diner were now seen pacing more frequently around the shop. They didn't talk to anyone, just observed. Beth became more convinced that something bad was about to happen. News of the disappearances of several former workers also began to spread in the surrounding neighborhood. There was a family looking for their daughter. There were neighbors wondering why a young man never came home. All the stories led back to Mrs. Blackwood's shop. But no one dared to accuse her outright. Mrs. Blackwood's name was too powerful. Her authority made people hesitant. In Portland, the investigative team immediately conducted a laboratory examination of the bone Daryl had brought. The initial results confirmed it was human bone. This finding strengthened the suspicion that there was a major crime behind the relish business. But they couldn't act rashly. They needed additional evidence to build a strong legal case. Miller and Captain Russo designed a strategy. They would place detectives near the shop in new disguises, while also tracing the money flowing into Mrs. Blackwood's shell company. Everything had to be done quietly, because if Mrs. Blackwood suspected, the evidence could disappear in an instant. Daryl returned to Port Blossom with a lighter heart, but the fear hadn't vanished. He knew Mrs. Blackwood might already suspect him. Every time he passed the alley to the shop, he felt eyes watching him from behind a window. Beth met him secretly, saying that Mrs. Blackwood was becoming harsher and the atmosphere inside was more terrifying. Daryl advised Beth to be careful, not to talk much, and to stay as far away from the production room as possible. But in his heart, he knew the danger was already too close. That night, Mrs. Blackwood stood for a long time in front of the production room. Her right hand gripped the key that always hung around her neck. She muttered quietly that the rat she was looking for would soon appear. A faint smile crossed her face, a smile that made several workers shiver. In the distance, the undercover police team began to log the shop's nighttime activities. The grinding machine was heard humming late into the night. Light shone through the window gaps. They knew the truth was hiding behind that always locked steel door. And in the midst of the tension, Daryl sat in his room with a long prayer. He knew a big step had been taken. Now he could only hope the police moved fast enough before Mrs. Blackwood made her most dangerous decision. The secret room is breached, revealing bones, hair, and vile notes. In Portland, the small briefing room at the police precinct was filled with maps, notes, and photos of Mrs. Blackwood's relish shop. Captain Russo stood at the whiteboard, explaining the strategy in a firm voice. They could no longer delay, as the bone evidence brought by Daryl was strong enough to request a warrant. However, they chose to move quietly. The goal was not just to arrest Mrs. Blackwood, but to dismantle the entire network that might be involved. Detective Miller proposed the raid be conducted in the early morning when activity at the shop was high, making it difficult for Mrs. Blackwood to hide anything. Other team members warned that Mrs. Blackwood was known to be cunning and influential. If this operation failed, she could disappear like a shadow. Everyone realized the stakes were very high. Meanwhile, in Port Blossom, the shop's atmosphere grew more menacing. Mrs. Blackwood seemed to be spending more time locked in the production room. Every time she came out, her face was cold and expressionless. She rarely spoke, but when she did, everyone fell silent. The workers began to feel that something big was about to happen. Beth secretly noted every change. She saw new materials being brought in at night. Large metal drums were placed in the corner of the warehouse. No one knew what they contained. A pungent smell seeped into their noses, making some workers vomit. But no one dared to ask. Daryl became more certain that Mrs. Blackwood was preparing something. When he tried to warn a young worker to be careful, the worker just shook his head and whispered that it was better to be quiet than to disappear. Those words stabbed Daryl in the heart, making him realize that everyone was actually living in the same fear. That night, in her large house connected directly to the shop, Mrs. Blackwood sat at an old wooden desk by candlelight. In front of her was a small notebook with numbers and names. She wrote quickly, as if making a final list. Occasionally, she would stop to look at a photo of her long-dead family, then return to writing. A faint smile etched itself on her lips, a smile that made her face look even more terrifying in the dim candlelight. She knew the police might already be on her trail. But she wasn't afraid. To her, as long as she held the key to the production room and the secret of the recipe, no one could truly stop her. Even if she had to sacrifice the people around her, she was willing. In Portland, the investigative team prepared their equipment. The cars were unmarked, not standard police cruisers. Team members were given disguises as health workers and longshoremen. Everything was designed to avoid attracting attention. Detective Miller received an additional report from Field Intel. The two strange men often seen around the shop had criminal records out of state. They were suspected of being Mrs. Blackwood's hired hands. That information made the captain even more certain that the operation had to be carried out immediately, before there were new victims. In Port Blossom that night, Daryl couldn't sleep. From his apartment window, he saw shadows walking back and forth in the alley. He heard faint whispers, like people searching for something. His feeling grew worse. He knew his time was almost up. He decided to write a short letter to his mother back home. In the letter, he asked for her prayers to stay safe, without explaining what was really happening. On the other hand, Beth heard shocking news. One of the male workers didn't show up again the next morning. The story was that he had been sent home because he wasn't cut out for the work. But Beth was sure that was just an excuse. Her fear intensified, and she began to consider running away. But where could she go? All roads seemed to be in Mrs. Blackwood's grip. The night before the operation, Captain Russo gathered the team. He advised everyone to stay calm, not to be provoked, and to focus on the evidence. He knew this case wasn't just about crime, but about fighting a terrifying shadow of power. And as dawn broke, the small streets of Port Blossom began to stir with the sounds of market vendors and the footsteps of buyers. No one knew that several of the people passing by were actually undercover officers. They were waiting for the signal to move. Inside the shop, Mrs. Blackwood stood with a calm face, her hand gripping the key that hung from her neck. She whispered quietly to herself that everyone who dared to defy her would soon be silenced forever. She stared at the tightly closed steel door of the production room and smiled faintly, as if ready to face whatever was coming. Dawn had just broken when the small streets of Port Blossom began to stir with the sounds of market vendors and the footsteps of buyers. From the outside, it looked like a normal morning, but behind the scenes, dozens of officers were scattered in disguise. Some carried fish crates, some pretended to sit at the diner. Others were disguised as longshoremen. At exactly 7 in the morning, a delivery van pulled up to the shop. 2 people in state health inspector uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. They knocked on the door, announcing they were there for a surprise inspection. Mrs. Blackwood appeared, her face calm. She invited them in without a hint of suspicion. However, the moment the door swung wide, a dozen other officers, the ones who had been disguised as fishermen and market-goers, stormed in from every direction. "Police! Don't move!" Captain Russo shouted. Mrs. Blackwood was stunned for a split second, but her expression quickly returned to an icy calm. She just stood still, her hand instinctively clutching the key around her neck. The workers inside screamed in fear and confusion. Detective Miller immediately secured Mrs. Blackwood. "Where is the main production room?" he demanded. She just smirked. "There is no other room. Only this one." But Miller didn't believe her. He looked toward the steel door in the corner of the room. "Open that door." Mrs. Blackwood shook her head. "It's just an old walk-in freezer." Since she refused, the officers were forced to breach it. The sound of a metal ram hitting steel echoed, shattering the morning silence of Port Blossom. The moment the door burst open, a foul, overwhelming stench rushed out, making the officers gag. It wasn't the smell of lobster. It was the coppery tang of blood and harsh chemicals. The room was dark and damp. In the center stood a massive, industrial-grade grinder. The walls were spattered with dark, reddish-brown stains, long since dried. In another corner was a pile of burlap sacks. When an officer kicked one open, its contents spilled out, not lobster shells, but scraps of clothing, shoes, and handbags. One of them was the canvas tote bag with the sunflower print that Chloe had always carried. The officers held their breath. "Check that machine," the captain ordered. The forensics team immediately went to work. They took samples from the deep crevices of the grinder's blades. And right there, they found it, matted, discolored fibers. A quick field test came back positive, human hair. Not only that, but in a desk drawer in the corner, they found a small, stained ledger. Inside was a list of names, dates, and weights. Chloe's name was at the top, followed by the names of Hannah and Sam, the other missing workers. Next to their names, a small, neat note, "Perfect batch." Underneath the room's rotting floorboards, they found dozens of small, scoured clean bone fragments, phalanges, teeth, and pieces of cartilage. The entire room was a testament to an unspeakable, systematic crime. Mrs. Blackwood remained silent, watching them. Her eyes were fixed on the grinder, not with remorse, but with something that looked like pride. Confession and trial. In the front room, Arthur collapsed to the floor, his body shaking violently. He wept without a sound. When officers questioned him, he just shook his head, muttering, "I didn't know. I didn't know anything." But his terrified eyes betrayed the lie. The other workers were taken to the station for statements. Beth sobbed hysterically, telling them about her suspicions, the terrible smell, and how she had been too terrified of Mrs. Blackwood to ever speak up. Daryl, who had been moved to a safe location before the raid, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. He knew his job was done. The news of the raid spread like wildfire. The people of Port Blossom were in a state of collective shock and disgust. Their proud, famous lobster relish shop was, in fact, a slaughterhouse. Media vans from Portland and Boston descended on the small town. Images of the grinder and the bone fragments filled the nightly news. The entire state of Maine was horrified. In the interrogation room, Mrs. Blackwood remained completely calm. She did not answer most of the questions, just offered the occasional, chilling smirk. "It's a family recipe," she whispered once, leaning toward the one-way glass. They offered themselves. They offered themselves to become part of perfection. Her words sent a chill down the detective's spines. She wasn't just a killer, she was a monster hiding in an old woman's skin. Arthur finally broke completely under questioning. Sobbing, he confessed that he knew his mother was doing something wrong, but he was too afraid of her to defy her. He admitted to helping her clean the machine late at night. He admitted to taking the excess, the parts that couldn't be ground, out on his boat and dumping them into the deep ocean. He knew Chloe had been in there. He knew his own wife had become part of the lobster relish. His confession shattered the hearts of everyone in the room. The dark legacy. The trial was dramatic and closely watched. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The hair in the grinder was a DNA match for Chloe, Hannah, and Sam. The bones were confirmed as human. Daryl became the key witness. His testimony about finding the finger bone in the relish jar was the final, sickening nail in the coffin. Arthur, for his complicity, was sentenced to life in prison. He accepted the sentence with a hollow, empty expression, as if it was the only punishment he deserved. As for Mrs. Blackwood, she was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, she just smiled. It was the same faint, knowing smile she wore when she heard people praise her magic relish. On the day she was being transferred to the Maine State Supermax prison, something strange happened. During the transport on a remote highway, the prisoner van was involved in a mysterious accident. In the ensuing chaos, Mrs. Blackwood escaped. No one knew how. It was as if she had simply vanished into the thick, coastal Maine fog. Some said she was helped by a powerful, unknown network. Others in Port Blossom whispered that she wasn't entirely human. Since then, her name has become a dark legend. The story of the Port Blossom lobster relish turned into a local horror story. The shop was condemned, sealed with police tape, but some locals still swear that on foggy nights, when the wind blows just right off the water, they can still smell the rich, savory aroma of lobster relish, mixed with something else. Something metallic, rancid,